cloud. All right, there we go. And let me share. All right, well, welcome everybody. And before we jump in, I just wanted to say thank you to Arlene, who was here from the Carlson Center with me. And for those of you who don't know, we'll spend a minute. We'll talk about the Carlson Center and what we do and who we are. So the Carlson Center at Sac State is really the hub for entrepreneurship and innovation around the Sacramento region. And let me share my screen. You guys can see a slide. Oops, excuse me, wrong sharing screen. There we go. The Carlson Center basically is the hub for entrepreneurship. And we're trying to really help the entire ecosystem for the region, as well as folks around the world, in connecting with the right resources and content. So most higher ed institutions focus on the students and alumni. We focus on everybody. So you and I and anyone starting a business, and hopefully that helps the growth of the region itself. We actually have quite a few events coming up. We'd love for you guys to register and be a part of them next week. And I think she's here also listening in. Andy Simon, one of the leading experts on blue ocean here in the US, will be joining me. We'll be doing a 2-hour workshop. Normally that would be definitely a for-fee event, but because the Carlson Center is nonprofit, it is free. So we encourage you. We're going to both be in person as well as we'll be having that online. So really encourage you. And then David Bland, one of the leaders in the world in testing business ideas, will be doing an on-site workshop for us the 29th. And then we have a 2-day boot camp in December that I'll be leading. So a lot of great content, and we try and go between in-person and hybrid. So we hope that you can join us. I'll jump into my quick introduction of myself as well. My role here at the Carlson Center is entrepreneur in residence. So I basically create a lot of the content like today, deliver it, and am also a consultant. So my Business Strategy and Innovation Institute do consulting for mid-sized to larger firms on how to innovate, where to play, how to grow, how to stay ahead of the competition. And so had many years working for lots of international firms as well as Fortune 500 and am a certified coach, one of the only few. My friend Andrew, who's online, is one of the others that's a certified coach for most of the leading frameworks like Strategizer, Blue Ocean, Lean Stack for a lean startup, and OKRs and other areas. So we'll jump in, and at the end, we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So I appreciate kind of holding them to the end. You can put them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. But I want to make sure we get you all the information. And these slides can be available so you don't have to take a lot of screenshots. So why are we here? Well, regulations can create new markets. This is probably something you've heard of, but there's really not been a lot of information on it published out there. So I'm here really to convince you today that there's a value in regulations, not just a negative connotation. And they can create huge opportunities for you and your business, whether you're a startup or a large firm looking to expand into new areas. So we're going to take a look at how they can work, why they're different, and what's unique about these attributes of these markets. So we're in a time of massive technological advancements right now, right? We have everything from climate technologies, CRISPR, AI, space, health tech, ag tech, you name it, right? EVs. So technology is an enabler that is speeding up competition, allowing new markets, new technologies, and the speed of everything is causing sometimes chaos, disruption, but also creates opportunity. So all these new emerging markets, the startups and existing companies will try and exploit and leverage. We need to understand how they act and what are unique attributes to those markets. That leads us to regulations. We as humans, we often create regulations that we hope help the community and the world at large. The thought is that government regulations create regulations to make sure businesses are acting in the best interests of citizens. Climate, again, AI, space, health, all of these, agriculture, will all have major legislation governing how businesses must act to play in them. Usually the mindset is looking at regulation in a negative connotation, right? The glass is half empty, it's going to cost me money. I just need to make sure I'm meeting some mandates. And it's usually looked at as a very negative thing, not as an opportunity. But at the same time, business executives, leaders, startup founders, we are all constantly changed on how to create competitive advantages and grow your business. One way to grow your business is to create new markets or blue oceans. One of my favorite topics to talk about, and I know some of my colleagues on the phone, other Zoom here also love to talk about this. And again, next week you can join us for a deeper dive in blue oceans, which is really a new way to create space, right? New markets that don't exist. How do I identify them? How do we create them? There's no competition. So the water is not bloody with the blood of you and your competitors battling over current customers. Think of new areas that never existed before. Obviously, iPhone, Uber and rideshare, things like that, where they didn't exist, and all of a sudden there's an entire new industry. My goal today is to help change your mind and mindset to also see regulations as an opportunity for growth and a potential blue ocean that you can take advantage of. Why now? One of the biggest important questions that I always ask, going into any space, why is this important right now to worry about? Well, the reality is that regulations are exponentially increasing and won't slow down anytime soon. So we need to find a way to create opportunity from them. There's at least 3,000 new rules added each year. There is over 104,000 regulations added from 1993 to 2018, as you can see on the screen. And there's currently over 100,000 regulations still in the books and over 200,000 pages of those regulations. So as you can see, we love regulations here, especially in the US. I know we have some colleagues from around the world joining us, but everywhere has regulations affecting it, especially those who want to play in the US, and especially in California, where I'm in Sacramento, which is the capital of California, which seems to be the hub for everything starting first, right? Whether it's EVs or agriculture or health. So you can see there is an exponential boom in regulations. We have to adhere to them. We have to comply with them. So we need to understand not just a way to comply, but how can we make these an opportunity, because it's never going to be ending. So the big question we need to ask ourselves that execs have been asking for years is, one, how do businesses take advantage of regulations? Right? Minimal work has been done to really understand the indirect and unintended competitive consequences of regulation. New markets are constantly opening up due to technical, political, regulatory change, but is there statistical proof that regulations create new markets? There is that prevailing thought that they do, but there's really been no quantitative evidence in the past. And the second is, what business model is best used for this new condition? The business model is really how you create, deliver, and capture value. But no work's really been done on how regulatory conditions affect business models. And the third one is, do regulatory markets act the same as traditional markets? So historically, there's a little bit of research and evidence on some of these questions, but not a lot. So I actually spent 3 years researching these topics for my doctorate dissertation on new markets and blue oceans. So I'm here today to present some of these findings to you that I've been slowly publishing over some newsletters recently and last year. So I conducted a study using the California smog check regulation market to figure out how companies can best take advantage of this opportunity. So you ask yourself, why the California smog check regulation market? Because it impacts more people and businesses in California than all other regulations except taxes. So it's massive, and it's been massive for decades. So along the way, I found many unexpected findings that we uncovered and that I'm going to talk about today. Hopefully you can take advantage of them. So the first was regulation types. And what I found was not all regulations are created equally. And what do I mean by that? Well, the first was that there are three types of regulations that I found. And some of these have been talked about in different terms in the past. But the first one, in simple terms, is a type of regulation that's something that we can do that you previously could not do. And so, a good example of that, especially in California and some other states, is you can now smoke marijuana, right? Or you can gamble. These were things before you couldn't do. So now you can do these regulations. The second was stuff that you must stop doing. Excuse me. You can't smoke in public. So we have to stop doing that in California, right? There's demand there, there's organic demand, but now you can't do that. You can't dump toxins in the water anymore, right? So businesses have to stop doing that. And the third one is must do. These are things we must adhere to. As an example, you see on the screen, you have to put on best before dates on food or medical prescriptions, things like that. And we call this artificial demand. And this term of artificial demand had come up decades ago, but it was rarely used. And so you'll see me using that throughout the presentation today to really talk about this unique concept in must-do markets. The customer needs from the must-do mandates are actually manufactured by the government. There is no consumer demand for these things. And we'll talk about the smog check for your cars or best before dates. And so this demand was generated by legislation, by these mandates. And that's a really important topic. So why does that matter? Well, past research has used terms like sticks or carrots or sermons to talk about legislation, as well as you're obligated or you have permission to or you're prohibited from to describe these differences. So this is really the first research that takes a look at all three of these types, must do, can do, and must stop, but then really ties them to demand and business model choices with real numbers. So now executives, you can understand these type of regulatory markets that are being created and figure out how is that going to affect consumer demand, something that they must do, something they must stop, which means the consumer demand will be shrinking, or just simply something that has been legalized that demand is already there. So that's important from an executive perspective. The second thing I found that I wasn't really expecting to find, I was hoping to, but wasn't sure, was around do blue oceans exist in new markets created by regulation? And the way that we look at that is through the lens of the North American Industry Classification System. So big words. And what does that mean? Well, it means NAICS codes. So what are NAICS codes? Well, NAICS codes are the way that the government recognizes new markets. So every 5 years, the US government publishes a list of classification, 6-digit codes that represent new markets or sub-markets that had not previously existed. And they continue to do this every 5 years when they see new markets emerge. And as you can see here on the screen, here are some automotive ones. And the one we're focusing on is down here, 811198, all other automotive repair and maintenance. And why that's interesting is before 1997 or 2002, that didn't exist. And so what I'll share is the findings here in 1996, the smog check tube, the market that we're talking about today, was enacted. And what that did was it let in California two different types of business models exist. Places that could come in and test your car for a smog check and get you a certification, and businesses that were already auto repair shops that could now do test and repair. That started in 1996. In 1997, the government published the NAICS code updates. And at that point, there were no codes existing for this market, other automotive repair and maintenance or emissions testing. But 5 years later, when they republished their market data, their NAICS codes, we see that they added this code of 811198 to all other automotive repair, maintenance, and emissions testing without repair. So what that means was that we've now proven quantitatively that these new regulations, the smog check market, actually pushed and created this new code, which really creates a new market in the NAICS code for government. So interesting finding that most people had thought about, but there had been never any quantitative proof before. So why that matters? Well, now you as a entrepreneur, a founder, a large or mid-market or small business can understand that you can take advantage of these new markets because blue oceans offer uncontested profitable growth, right? There's no competition there. There are new markets with lots of consumer demand. So now you can actually go into these markets with confidence. And we'll talk about how these must-do regulations act a little bit differently. And to our knowledge, this is the first research that quantitatively proves that a state regulatory, like the smog check, can actually create a blue ocean. The next thing we found was, and this is a big one, that there are no early adopters in this market, and that's a big deal. And so some of you are wondering, what's an early adopter? Well, an early adopter are those people in the picture that wait outside the very first Apple store in San Francisco and want the iPhone 1. So I don't know how many of you are iPhone 1 users. Probably not very many, if any. I know I was iPhone 6 was the first one I used. And so early adopters are those people who are basically saying whatever problem that they have, whatever offering, service, market you want to talk about, that the way they're getting a job done is not good enough and they want a better way to solve that problem. They have money to put towards solving the problem. They're actively looking for new solutions. And in this case, it was the iPhone, right? They knew it was coming out. You take your old phone and your computer, you're putting them together, and that was Steve Jobs' basic message to the market. Most of us, like me, were fine with my BlackBerry, right? So I was not an early adopter. In most markets, and this is what we teach at the Carlson Center, you should be looking for early adopters, right? Those are the people who in any new market are looking for your goods and services first. It's not the rest of the market. So we wanted to understand, do these must-do markets act differently? And in fact, they do, because there are no early adopters. And this is a really important distinction. So many of you might have seen this diffusion of innovation curve in the past. Just about every known market there is, doesn't matter if it's a service, a product, whatever type of offering, any geo in the world, follow this curve of we call it the diffusion of innovation curve, been around since the 60s. And it might vary from a few percentage points in certain markets, which is not a big deal. But in general, most business leaders, and especially in the startup community, we take a look at the beginning here. We call, the early adopters, innovators, we kind of lump them together. And those 16% of people is who we're trying to find that are saying and raising their hand, hey, I've got a problem and I'm interested in your new offering in this new market. And it usually takes you about 3 to 5 years to get to this space where you're getting into the majority of the market. And many of you might have heard of the chasm, Geoffrey Moore's book years ago, Crossing the Chasm. Well, this is the chasm. And these people are who we're trying to go after in most markets to get a foothold, get traction, prove your offering has value, so the rest of the market will follow suit. But what we learned here is through the data, this seems to be the only known market so far that's been published that does not have early adopters. And what I found is, as you can see on the curve at the top here, this is the smog check market. And this is your traditional diffusion curve down here, which on the screen, I know it looks like probably the same thickness. And that's a normal curve for any market, right? Maybe it's a little flatter in some cases, but in general, that's what it looks like. In the smog check market for California, it doesn't look like that. It literally started from day one at a fully mature market, over $425 million in year one in revenue. So this is a really, really unique distinction. The only known market so far that does not have this. The triggering event that we'll talk about is the smog check notice that you get in the mail that says, hey, you need to go get your car smogged this year if you want to renew your license and be able to drive your car. So there has to be a carrot or a stick, an incentive or a penalty for you to actually act on and do something in these must-do markets. Otherwise, we would just throw the letter away and not act on anything. So there has to be some sort of penalty or incentive. But in this case, we can see that the smog check market has bypassed the normal early market stages of innovators, early adopters, as well as the product creation stages of concept creation, concept development, market development, and it goes right to maturity. And I'm sure other markets might vary slightly, but in general, we can assume that must-do markets are going to uh, uh, work this way and have these same effects. Here's what your triggering event looks like. And so in the startup world, even if you're a large company looking to go into new spaces, we're looking for triggers. What is causing the user, the consumer business to act, to do something? A bad experience, a change in their circumstance, or awareness are usually the three triggers that are causing us to do something. In the case of the regulatory market, it's usually a carrot, an incentive, or a stick, right, which is a penalty. And in this case, if you want to drive your car legally in California, you got to go get it smogged, and you're going to get one of these in the mail that says, hey, you got to go do this and take it to a smog certification required at a star station right here in big bold letters. So that's our triggering event. Why this matters? Well, it reshapes how leaders should design, scale, and compete in regulatory industries where opportunity emerges from legislation mandate rather than consumer desire. Competitive advantages shifts from trying to persuade people using marketing, promotion, to more of how quickly can I get somebody in and out to meet this minimum mandate, to become eligible, to just meet this, triggering event that they have to meet. The market can be fully born and mature, which obviously creates huge incentives from day one rather than having to slowly grow into a market. Many of you might be aware of some of the historical thought leaders in this space. The person who created that diffusion curve is named Everett Rogers. And so in this case, there is no diffusion of innovation curve. It doesn't exist because it starts at the high point. In regulatory markets, there is no chasm to cross. As we talked about Geoffrey Moore and crossing that chasm to get to the big part of the market, that chasm doesn't exist. And the third, Michael Porter, right, one of the fathers of modern business, talked about regulation being a stimulator for revenue and for opportunity and for markets. Well, in this case, regulation can actually manufacture the entire market, not just stimulate it. And Ash Maurya, who I work with from kind of lean startup mentality, talking about trigger identification and what's happening with these early adopters. Where in this case, the trigger identification is the key, not about identifying early adopters. So to our knowledge, this is the first quantitative research that actually demonstrates a market that doesn't have early adopters. So if you know of others, we'd love to hear about them. The next thing that was a really interesting finding I didn't expect was around life cycles. We'll talk about S curves, and some of you are wondering, well, what's an S curve? So every business has a life cycle. And we looked at that from that diffusion curve, right? And we talk about this in business terms as an S curve, and really it's almost a misnomer, right? If you drew the line down here to the rest of um, the timeline, you would see that entire curve. Well, if you just cut that off, that looks like an S, at least the closest letter we can come up with, right? That makes it sound cool and fun. So it's called an S curve. And usually every market starts with infancy, then it grows, then you mature up here in stage 3, and then you start declining. And this is the same for every product or service market in the world. The question is, how long do these stages last, right? And can you keep your market going? So it's thought that all markets have these, and the diffusion curve we just saw without the rest of the tail, right, looks like this. And why these matter, why you need to understand the S curves is because about timing. Are you going to be here at the top of the market and trying to invest? Or are you investing resources, time, equipment down here, or even here in the growth stage? So if you see that your market or your offerings are declining, it's probably time to either recreate a new market, move away from that business model in that market, and not really investing a bunch of time and resources. So it's really important from a timing and betting perspective for investment, as well as overbuilding too early or starving growth. Where am I on this curve? Pricing, moving from penetration and land grab tactics to building maybe a more efficient and mature as you're getting older. portfolio management. Many of you might have many pieces to your company. So balancing businesses across phases for cash, revenue opportunity, growth, and then signals to watch for. My lifetime value, the acronyms down here are cost of acquisition, adoption rates, churn of my customers. So depending on where we're at on this curve, we can actually better understand resources, what's the future going to hold. Maybe we're on the top, we're coming down, so we need to start looking at innovation. Strategy cycles are compressing, so timelines for all these things are getting shorter, right? Technology is enabling us to move faster. So some of the thought leaders, Boston Consulting Group talks about businesses moving through their life cycles twice as quickly as they did 30 years ago. And Bain and Company talk about the key to understand where you are on the curve and where your customers are on the curve as well, because customers' needs are changing. They might be moving out of your market faster than you are. And then McKinsey, best CEOs form a point of view on what the next performance S curve is for their company. So we always need to be exploring as well as exploiting our current market, looking at our next areas of investment and our S curves. So we need to understand where we are there. That leads us into business models, and I'll tie that in a second. And as I mentioned previously, your business model is how you create, deliver, and capture value. And why that's an important definition is that business models' lifespans are shrinking. So again, McKinsey talks about most of us, our business models are at risk. Right? If we haven't been refreshing our business model in the last few years, it's probably out of date and stale, probably not hitting the mark for our customers. And Boston Consulting Group talks about that the average business model lifespan has fallen from 15 years to 5 years. So again, if we're not refreshing it, really looking at where we are, exploring new spaces, one of those hopefully can be regulations, then we're really not keeping up with our business well enough. And here's a great slide that illustrates this. Right? How many of us still shop at Blockbuster? Probably not many, the one in Bend, Oregon. And these are easy to think about because they're consumer-facing brands. We all know they've gone out of business. But more than half of the Fortune 500 in the last 15 years don't exist. And that's a scary thought. And that's the speed of technology, globalization, consumer choices, competition coming from everywhere, right? New disruptive startups. We need to keep an eye on where we are at on our business life cycle and how we can continue to refresh that. And how that leads into tying it back to the S curves. Well, what I found, if we look at that normal S curve on the right that we talked about here, stages, business models had never been looked at in terms of S curves. It was just markets or products or offerings. And what I found here, as you can see in the left side, is that the test only revenue also follows an S curve. That's the business model for those companies who only offered those test only services for the mandates in California. So as you could cut it off here and you still have that S curve. And then the second one was the repair and test revenue. It also follows an S curve, but it's inverted, right? We'd have to actually move the tail back down. And so it's a really interesting concept that now business models, we can actually have their own S curves, not just markets or products or services. They might actually start at different points, but at the end of the day, they follow some similar patterns. So now if we know that, and our business models, according to McKinsey and Bain, the timeline is shrinking, we can understand where we are in our business model life cycle as well. Why it matters, again, recapping that, we use the S curve as planning lens from a business leader perspective, decide what to build, how hard to invest, when to pivot. We've now measured this at the business model level that didn't exist previously. And to our knowledge, it's the first study that provides quantitative evidence that business models can follow an S curve life cycle as well. The next thing I found was, again, unintended consequence when looking at this, and we're getting to, the crux of the study, which was which business model was best to use, and that'll be the last one. But this one, we found that extended market life cycles existed because legislation can prop up the market. And what we mean by that is this is the entire life cycle so far of the California smog market. My study ended really here in 2014, published in 2016, so data was around 2014 to 15. But as you can see, it continued on. What I found was really interesting. In most cases, we would think that the S curve would die over here in about 2005, and then you would think a new market would take its place. Again, dying over here around 2013, a new market would take its place. But the market didn't die, and that's because there was regulation enacted that propped up the market to keep it going. The very first regulation was AB 2515. Basically was the beginning of a directive from the Bureau of Automotive Repair that directed people to go get their car smogged, right? That was the very first one. And as you can see, that's where the market started, and it started way above the curve we would expect on the down here on the bottom. But we would expect the market to be dying around 2005, but instead they introduced California legislation, SB 629, that basically, again, propped up the market. It was around technology, having to do different things with the smog check. And that instilled more organic growth within this market to consumers to have to go get their cars smogged. So as you can see, again rose. The market all the way through 2013 was continuing to expand. And then again, as it was dying in 2014, 2015, AB 2289 was enacted to again put further pressures on things you have to do as a consumer in the California market. And since then, it's been growing. I'm sure it will be dying again soon. But these are unique attributes to this must-do legislative market that has not been seen anywhere else, that it continues to prop up the market even when it should be dying. So most for-profit sectors would be being taken over. And so here I put in a normal S curve where we would expect to see, think about the music industry, which we all know. Vinyl was dying, that could be vinyl, and then the tape cassette came in, and the tape cassette was dying, and the CD came in, and the CD starts to die, and now Spotify comes in, right? These are normal S curves for different markets and businesses. The smog market and the must-do artificially demand-induced markets don't follow these similar curves because legislation can prop them up. And so why that matters is in traditional markets, your market's going to die or be replaced by a new solution, usually driven by technology. But in these must-do markets, we can prop up the markets. You can actually be one of the ones helping push legislation, working with lobbyists, helping prop these up so it lives for many more years. Now you can plan around these predictable events. So if a new legislative mandate takes effect, you can understand that this market's going to continue on. More revenue, more staff, more resources, work with lobbying groups, keep an eye on certification changes and rulemaking calendars. We know when are cycles for new mandates. And so to our knowledge, this is among the first quantitative studies to show how regulatory mandates can extend the life cycle of a must-do or artificially induced market. So pretty interesting. And the last one, which is the most important, the reason I started this study, was to compare business models. In these markets, these must-do markets, which business model is the best to go after so that we know exactly what to deploy. And to do that, I looked at these two distinctly different business models. And the only variable that was different was automotive businesses that were adding testing services to their already, other automotive repairs that they do. So they call them test and repair, or test only business models that all they did was just do certification to meet the California smog mandate, like Smog and Go, as you see in the picture. This is the first really incremental approach where smog testing was added down here to a business, up here in the top one, whether you're doing a brake inspection or a lube and oil change, something else, adding that to that. And so looking at these two things, I was able to compare which one of these two had the significant revenue versus the other one, if there was. What we found was that price had no impact. So when people talk about, oh, well, it must have been because the price of Smog and Go was less. Nope, price had a significantly no difference. It was almost identical price. So what it came down to was, what does the consumer need? What were they actually focused on providing? And what we found is that the key business model that wins in an artificial demand market or a must-do market is the business model that only focuses on helping the consumer meet the minimum mandate, not the value-added traditional market business model that we would assume. My assumption was adding value to your customer base. You already have an automotive repair shop. You're going to add this service. You can, rotate your tires and get an oil and lube at the same time you're getting your car smogged, would be the most successful financial business model. That was not the case. Test-only business model stations were 3 times more successful from a revenue standpoint than their competitive test and repair business models. That is huge and significant. And so when we think about this, the consumer only wants to do the minimum to meet their mandate, right? They're not there to, get my car diagnosed and fixed and everything else. They're like, no, I just want to get this letter, get my certificate, send it to the state, get my renewal notice so I can keep driving. And because we're putting that artificial demand on the consumer, they don't want the bells and whistles and value-added services. And so as we can see here, 3 times the revenue is significant. So we need to understand that when we get into markets that are must do, where artificial demand is telling us we have to do something, the consumer or business only wants to meet the minimum mandate. Here's what the revenue looked like, and what it shows is I took throughout the entire life from 1998 all the way to 2015, and there was no significant difference within time period. So the entire life of the market over 17 years of studies showed that it was at least 3 times more profitable all the way through, and sometimes more than 4 times more profitable. So why it matters, as we wrap up, we want to treat regulation as a market maker, right? A rule that compels us to do something, that it creates a real market to design for, not merely a compliance cost to absorb. Design to the mandate first. Build the simplest business model that gets customers compliant every time, right? Add services only if they increase somebody's, speed and efficiency, not having to come back to you to get certified again. Invest in operations, not extras, right? It's not about all these bells and whistles. It's just about, can I get the consumer in? Can I get them to meet the minimum mandate and get them out? Plan with confidence. So now you know that these must-do markets, you have a population example of consumers in California that own cars that have to do something. So now you can take that stable base for forecasting, for revenue, for investment. And to our knowledge, this is the first study to compare business model types in a new market created by regulation, and to show that the model designed to meet the minimum mandates outperforms other business models. So I've wrapped all this together in a theory called artificial demand theory. And really what artificial demand theory says, kind of tying these together, is a new market can be created by regulation if the penalties or incentives are significant enough. In must-do regulatory markets, government creates artificial demand that drives consumer behavior. The business model focusing solely on offering a service to meet the minimum requirements of the regulation will be the most significant and favorable. And there are no early adopters in must-do markets, only triggering events that cause consumers to take action. And must-do markets can start fully matured, unlike standard markets. And additional legislation can prop up these must-do markets and extend their life cycles. And here's just a visual framework I've created for this theory that I'll continue to publish articles on each specific attribute and finding. So in wrapping up, regulatory markets are a way to create your own new market or blue ocean, or to take advantage of one that's been created. These findings require executives to toss out those preconceived ideas that traditional business models are best, and that these markets might follow normal patterns. They don't. So this should give business leaders confidence and evidence to move into these markets and see these as opportunities. I'll stop there and wanted to take time to answer questions. All right, left us with 17 minutes. Perfect. So I know I said a lot. Hopefully it wasn't overwhelming, and hopefully you got lots of questions. Let me see in the chat if there's any questions. I don't see any questions in the chat. Who's got a question? Go ahead and just unmute and ask away.
Good morning, Brian. Question for you regarding the revenue drop that occurred in roughly 2014-15. The question is why? The mandate was there. The mandate says that if your car is more than X years old, I don't remember what the number is, then you must get this smog check done every X number of years. And did technology change? Was there there was a new law? Was there new equipment, new tests that needed to get done to increase the revenue? Why did it drop off at all?
Yeah, great question, Eric. And I honestly don't know the specific answer to how far the 14-15 revenue dropped and why, because my study actually stopped in 15. So it's kind of like, you get that lagging data by the time they report on stuff. But after I went back, the past year or two to look at it, what it seems is very similar to the previous two spikes that the legislation helped prop up. Was sometimes you would get most of the cars through, and then we'd see, okay, we've gotten most of the cars smogged who were from the 1980s and 70s, and all the bad polluters. And then they made some changes that said, oh, okay, well, now we have to get these sort of cars smogged, and people have to use these pieces of equipment that are better at detecting smog. So the technology and evolution just kept moving and going faster. So it was interesting that legislation kept changing what technology had to be used because it got better, as well as what sort of cars had to get tested over those periods. So I think it will continue to evolve like that, but it's a great question. I'm hoping some people do some more research into these sort of things as well, because mine stopped really at 2015. Good question, though. Chris, I see you had a comment here. Okay. Yeah. Any other questions for folks right now? Or how to
Brian, great study and presentation of the research that you did. I really appreciate it. Very thought-provoking. Creates a lot of strategic opportunities. One of the questions, I have the same one, is like regulations right now. I would think that, especially here in California, some of the regulations around data privacy and procedures, the must do around usage of AI might create some what was the term that you said, the where it's like a forced market or
artificial demand.
yeah, or it creates some artificial demand for those companies. Every company is using AI. So is that an example of something current that you think might be a blue ocean?
Well, I would answer it this way: is the regulatory or the legislative mandate, is it making us, consumer or business, right, do something we don't want to do? Well, that would be the must do, right? Like put a best on date or born on date, right, on food, right, as an example. The food processing industry didn't want to do that. So it's like extra cost. I got to buy machines. I got to do that. I got to get my car smogged. Are they making us use AI, right? Or to your point, maybe making us have guardrails around AI that are safety or things like that? If so, then yeah, we have to meet some compliance things. Or is it stuff that we now either must stop doing, like smoking, but there's already organic demand there for AI, or that we can do, again, like, smoke marijuana, we want to do it, there's organic demand, we want to use AI. Which of these mandates is it allowing? Is it allowing organic demand to happen, or is it putting, you know, security, parameters around AI that we have to do X, and now it's, something we don't want to do, but we have to do it. Then it would be, to your point, yeah, I think it would be a must-do artificial demand new market.
Yeah, ironically, I used AI to look some of these up. I was like, what are some must-do regulations?
That's great. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. And Chris, I know Chris is here and he's in this space. So, Chris, any thoughts or questions from what you're working on?
Well, I look at regulations as always blue ocean. We work in banking, finance, and the water sector. And my wife and I were just having a discussion last night about this session today, and speaking about the fact that regulations will always exist because the regulatory agencies have to justify their position in the world. So in that, it's better to work within those regulations and determine why those regulations were thought of and put into place. And in that gap, you'll find your blue ocean. So to give you a for instance, we're in developing a product called Tortuga. And Tortuga is a water testing application using artificial intelligence and uh, uh, regulatory compliance factors that vary greatly across the United States to test water. So just in California, there's probably 16 agencies that have regulations around water testing. That doesn't account for city and county regulations that may follow along EPA regulations and those kind of things. But in those gaps, you can find blue ocean space because of the fact that nobody's exacerbating those gaps. We are, and I can't get into why we're doing it and how we're doing it right now in this call, but we are, and those gaps from a potentiality point of view is billions of lost dollars in revenue to an organization. And so we're going to be leveraging that. So I see regulation as a way to say, hey, this is what they want us to do. How can we work with them to create innovation and incentives that maybe nobody else has thought of?
Mm-hmm. Yep, I know you're working on stuff that can't divulge too much, but thank you. Yeah, I was glad you're here. So hopefully some of these nuggets will help you in your business model as you guys are going.
Always.
Yeah. I would love to see some faces. I know many of you are around the world, but I'd love to get a quick screenshot, and I'll put that out on LinkedIn today and say thanks for coming. And you guys can also repost and comment. Would love that. I appreciate everyone being here. Edward, thanks for coming from the Netherlands. I love my international folks joining, and I know Andrew had to leave, but anyone else that's out there that can be on screen, I would love it. All right, I'll take a quick screenshot. All right, here we go. Wonderful. I put my information in the chat. Did everyone see that? LinkedIn, the newsletter. I'd love you to follow the newsletter that's here on LinkedIn, as well as the events coming up for the Carlson Center. So we'd love to have you guys join us. If you're in person in SAC, wonderful. Virtually next week with Andy, who was here. Again, two of us doing a Blue Ocean workshop that you'd normally probably have to pay quite a bit for, but because the Carlson Center, it's free, so you could join remote as well. And then we have some again stuff with David Bland, so some world-class thought leaders on these areas. Any last comments? JDM, thanks for joining. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I was was fascinated by a lot of this, and the thing that I was honestly most surprised about was that there wasn't research on this before, because like a large chunk of it does feel fairly self-explanatory, right? Like to somebody like in my space, and I don't do much corporate innovation anymore, as you know, but like that there are no early adopters makes sense, right? Because you just have this like sudden hammer, come down. It's like a triggering event. But what I actually found most surprising in what you shared was that the value adds don't work. That's actually super surprising to me because you're like, well, you're forcing them into an opportunity where those other services are also purchased, and so it makes natural sense for those things. So that was super interesting. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Cool. Thanks for being here. And yeah,
Uh,
I go ahead, Eric. You have a question?
Brian,
Yes, sir.
so if, for example, state of California legislature is considering some new legislation, uh, take the concept of smog testing for cars and translate it forward 25 or 30 years and say what would make sense for next year. And they're working on writing legislation, and there's a clear force behind that regulation. Why would that not become an example of this same thing? It's going to become a mandate. Everybody's going to need to do it. I mean, while they're planning the legislation, you can read what's going on and tell, does this affect everybody, or is this just a small minority of the population? And it should be pretty obvious 2 years before it happens.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. And I would put it this way, Eric, is most business leaders aren't looking at those trends, right? They're not doing what you just said. You know, Chris is a startup founder, can attest to that. If every startup person in his space was looking at this and looking with the lens that new markets can create opportunity or regulatory mandates, as well as to your point, keeping an eye on what's happening in legislation, there'd be a lot more people in there. But again, there's only a handful of you guys on this call, so anybody in the world could be doing this. But as I see as a management consultant on a daily, weekly basis, most business leaders are just so focused on keeping the lights on what they do that they're not looking at opportunities, trends, keeping their eye on what's happening in their ecosystem. So you are ahead of the game, right? Because you are understanding what to do. Yeah.
So, for example, there's been talk for several years about regulating AI. So, let's say some entrepreneur in this audience decides to go out and write a piece of software that will evaluate whether or not a piece of AI, a ChatGPT or one of their competitors, for example, is whether you can identify whether uh, there's a watermarking facility in AI software of this ilk. And some have said that they watermark what they produce, and some have said that they don't. ChatGPT does not. But what if somebody wrote a piece of software to identify the author based on the watermark and went and talked to the legislature and said, look, this isn't hard to validate. So why not write a regulation that says a new law that says that every piece of uh, uh, IP created by an AI piece of software needs to be watermarked, and we have the software to validate it, and it's not going to be expensive for people to do. Here's how they do it. A combination of seeking and creating an opportunity. Wouldn't that work?
So to answer your question, I'm not sure I can say would it work or not, but great scenario. And I know Mike's got his hand up, going back to the AI. But what we need to think about and remember is even as great as your idea or my idea could be for regulation, we have to get it actually passed, right? So we can have all the great ideas in the world, but it still has to become a law. And so you've got to work with lobbyists, you got to work with these, legal groups to get it through. And years I've been doing this, one of the things that was always I thought, playing devil's advocate is, well, we can create this, but now you're just creating more legislation. Well, there's two checks and balances. One is we hire, the assembly and, legislatures to actually do this. So it has to get through them and get voted on. So we can waste our time with all a bunch of nonsense regulations, it'll never get through, and you're just, you're just shouting to nobody. So it's got to be worthy of getting through, and it's got to be good for the general public, and then you have something, right? So
Yeah, that's why you
the
have a
first thing.
marketing effort.
Yeah, and and usually it's the lobbyists and the groups like that to have a champion and assembly person. So yeah, that's the first thing, is making sure it's worthy and then getting it actually through, and that will take time. So Mike, your hand's up, go for it.
That was exactly where my comment was going to go, is the business strategy to artificially create artificial demand and to create the regulations that could be favorable to their business while also benefiting people on the planet
That's right.
would be a sound business investment from a strategic perspective.
Yeah, I'm actually in the process, and have been. I've been a procrastinator of putting this into a book and new market creation, but actually putting a blueprint, which is, it's not hard, it's out there, of from idea all the way through what are the steps to get it through, to become legislative mandate through California, right? And you could cookie cutter that to most states. What has to happen? What are the big milestones, right? How to actually best do that. So then you, as a business person like Chris, can say, here, I want to create the mandate. Now I know how to best optimize the mandate. But again, if it's not a benefit to those political people and lobbyists and assembly, you're not going to get it through. So, right, it's got to be, and it's got to be worthy to the public.
Can I add that a great example of all of that is there was a time when people would get on a roof to install solar in a residential capacity, and everybody was good to go with that. Well, there was an organization that decided that there was a lot of errors that were taking place, so they created a certification program, and that certification program then had some, I'll call it nuances to it from that organization. And those nuances excluded other players in the market just by those nuances. They then had the legislature push that through as a regulation. So now today, in order for somebody to install solar on your roof, they've got to be certified. Well, for 15 to 20 years, those certifications can only be acquired through one organization because of those nuances that were created. That organization made millions and millions and millions of dollars selling certification courses to those people who had to have the card carrying authority to be on a roof to do solar. They created a market, created a regulation, and reaped millions of dollars in benefit.
Yeah, it's a great example, Chris. Absolutely. Thanks for sharing. I know we're at time. I really appreciate you all joining today, listening, participating. I'll make these slides available to anybody who wants them. Just email me, and hopefully you can connect, if we're not, with LinkedIn, my website. If you, I'll put my email in here again in case you missed it. And please just get a hold of me, and also through the Carlson Center at Sac State, you can also get a hold of me. So I hope to see more of you all soon, and thank you again for joining. I appreciate it.